Here we go. Assalamu alaikum. And it's nice to join you all again. Let me make sure I have all of my things working. It looks like it. Alhamdulillah. So, mashallah, here we are in the last 10 days of Ramadan. And here we are in the last lecture of our 4-part series on ethical exemplars. al-Mu'mineen Aisha and Amir al-Mu'mineen Umar. May Allah be pleased with them. I hope you've enjoyed the other lectures, and if this is the first one you're listening to, know that there are 3 previous lectures, and this is the final one in the series. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. It's a great blessing to be once again on the CMC platform and be with this blessed community of scholars and students during the holy month of Ramadan, alhamdulillah. At the end of our last lecture, lecture 3, I was speaking about focusing primarily on Umar ibn al-Khattab and his many actions as Amir al-Mu'mineen, and in particular, the ways that he focused on the welfare of the Muslim community, his ethics, his commitment to taking care of his people. We talked about the Year of Ashes and the extraordinary actions that he undertook during that time to demonstrate his solidarity with those who are suffering and to create support programs to relieve their burden. So this is one of the things that we see about Sayyidina Umar, is that it's not just about personal virtues or his own, what he does for himself in terms of his akhlaq and his zuhud, and but it's also what he does for the community. So he's always wedding these 2 things, as are all of those great companions of the Blessed Prophet who have these public roles. We see that these 2 things go hand in hand. Now, Sayyidina Umar was murdered, and as we said, he's lingered for 3 days from the stab wounds that he sustained by a slave who had come to him. It wasn't his, but he had actually been a captive of war, and he came to him and he asked Umar for, he wanted more in terms of what he was receiving in terms of his work. So there was actually this open relationship where he could just come talk to Sayyidina Umar, who actually investigated and then came back to him and said, no, this is fair, you're getting what you need. And like with other captives, they were allowed to work towards their freedom, and that would show that they were able to support themselves. Also, they could be good members of society, and so that way they would be reintegrated or integrated for the first time into the Muslim community. But this person clearly was not a person of khair. He used that easy access to Umar to kill him. During that time, Sayyidina Umar, he asked, he called together a group of companions who were he had heard the Blessed Prophet Muhammad say that they were companions of paradise. He gathered them together and said, one of you needs to succeed me. You decide among yourselves. I don't want that burden. I've had enough of a burden while I'm alive. I don't want the burden when I'm dead for what happens. And then he also sent for Aisha and asked her if she would give him permission to be buried in her home, which she did, subhanAllah. And so this shows the great respect that she had for him. Now, one point to note that I will come back to later is that among the 6 companions who Sayyidina Umar chose to be that council, that committee to decide who was the next leader of the Muslim Ummah. He emphasized numerous times that he did not want his son, Abdullah ibn Umar, to be anywhere around, that he could play a role of just carrying out the carrying out the plans, the instructions, but he should not be involved in making the choice. He wanted him to stay away from any political position. And Sayyidina Umar, he called, he had already given the responsibility for his public affairs to his daughter Hafsa. So here we see, again, as Abu Bakr had chosen his daughter Aisha to take care of the family and his personal affairs, Umar chose his daughter Hafsa to do the same. So it shows something about their esteem for women, their ability to handle matters dealing with money, finance, taking care of the family, and all of these things. I have mentioned many times during this series that there is a incorrect perception of Sayyid Umar, that he was, that he didn't like women. And that's just not the case. It's not the case that he didn't respect women. Yes, there were, he was eager to uphold the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent, and he was equally tough with women as he was with men when they were violating the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. But he also had been corrected by the Blessed Prophet when he had gone too far. And I mentioned last week a number of the cases where we saw situations where Umar learned to restrain himself. His wife, Atika, and I want to just read this because there are in some contemporary literature, these statements by some people about Umar and his relationship with his wives. Well, when he died, his wife Atika bint Zayd is the one who lamented him very publicly. And so she recited poetry where she lamented him. For example, Atika said, "O my eye, shed all your tears copiously, and weary not of weeping for the noble Imam." That's Umar. "Fate brought me distress with the death of this cavalier who wore the badge of courage on the day when there was much agitation and toing and froing. He was the protector of his people, their helper against fate, the succor of the afflicted and the deprived. Tell those who are happy and those in distress, no, just die. Fate has given Umar death's cup from which to drink." Meaning, so this is this very emotional lament and saying how much they had lost with Umar. So she mourned her husband, as did the whole Muslim Ummah. Now, after the death of Umar, the great companion Uthman succeeded him. He was chosen among the six to be the next leader of the Muslim Ummah. He had a long reign, and it was not an easy time. Whereas during the time of Sayyidina Umar, the Muslim Ummah was expanding, but he also found it very challenging keeping track of his governors. There are so many narrations about Umar calling back his governors, his generals, disciplining them, trying to keep a hold, in this. How do you keep a hold of this expanding empire and keep track of what people were doing? And Uthman found it increasingly difficult because the amount of territory that he was responsible simply expanded more and more. It was a difficult time. He tried to use what means he could to keep track, which meant relying on people he could trust. And that included necessarily many of his family. Later historians would unnecessarily call that nepotism. It wasn't nepotism. It was using the people who he could trust to really understand what was going on. But there were people, in this large Muslim Ummah now, and people who were under the jurisdiction of the Muslim Ummah that now there were many who were not sincere, who were not shaped by the Blessed Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even during the time of the Blessed Prophet, there were munafiqun. And so, as we know, Sayyidina Uthman was murdered by a group of belligerents who came from Egypt. Sheikh Abd Hakim has a whole lecture in his series on Sayyidina Uthman, where he explains and talks about his great piety and what a noble and great companion he was. And so when Uthman was killed, everyone was just shocked and upset, horrified by what had happened, even those who sometimes had disagreements with him. And that's normal. You know, it's normal that you could have disagreements or criticisms. And we see the companions always doing that. But for someone to go to the point of murdering this blessed companion, it was just horrifying. Of course, Aisha was among those who was horrified. And she, along with two of those companions who were promised paradise by the Blessed Prophet, Talha and Al-Zubair, they insisted they wanted revenge for those who had murdered Uthman. They did not set out to fight Sayyidina Ali at all. And they were very clear about that. They just wanted to make sure that there was accountability for Sayyidina Uthman. And things got out of hand. And there were many agitators in the among the supporters of Sayyidina Ali who really caused trouble. And we know that it ended in a terrible disaster with Talha and Al-Zubair being killed. In that, Aisha was protected, and Sayyidina Ali sent her sent her safely back to Medina under the care of her brother Abdurrahman, to make sure that no one would hurt her. So it was a terrible disaster, but many of those people who were in Sayyidina Ali's army and his supporters eventually would turn against him. And we know that Ali was assassinated by people who were previously his supporters, who became known as the Khawarij, those who had supported him and then left him because they disagreed with him. So we see that it was, a terrible time. I'm not going to go more into those details because that's not the point of this series. The point of this series is to focus on the on the example that both Aisha and Umar set in their virtues, their personal virtues and character, as well as what they did for the Muslim Ummah. So after this all happened, of course, it was, very upsetting, but we have to be very careful. And this is something that I've emphasized before, is that so many of the reports at this time simply cannot be verified. They cannot be verified. There is not the evidence or the kind of asanid, the isnad or chain of transmission that can let us know what is true and what is false. Think about how much effort it takes to sift through the reports that are attributed to the Blessed Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have this whole apparatus of scrutinizing hadith reports just to know what the Blessed Prophet said. Well, what about, what the statements of Aisha or Ali or Umar, what about their statements? Do we have the same reliable apparatus? No. We can attempt to sift through and compare, but we do not have the same support for really knowing. And especially in all of these cases, if you look at these reports, there are so many reports of secret conversations or what someone whispered to someone or did behind. And those are just, they're completely unverifiable. And when there are reports like that, you know that it's because, if there aren't facts that are accessible to many people, then people can say whatever they want. So we should look instead to the actions of the people that are verified. And one of the things that we see is that, the companions kept relationships with each other. They intermarried into each other's families. For example, Umar ibn al-Khattab married the daughter of Ali ibn Abi Talib, so Kulthum bint Ali. Why would Sayyidina Ali marry his daughter to Umar if he resented him or thought that he usurped his position or something like that? So we should be really careful about these things. Similarly, when we look at, for example, something I'll talk about shortly, which is how Sayyidina Aisha, she used to correct other companions when they made a mistake about the sunnah. So she would tell other companions that what they had said was wrong, they misunderstood, and she was public about that. Why was she public about that? Because when it comes to the sunnah of the Blessed Prophet, you have to be public, because this information is for everyone. I mean, the religion is built on the sunnah as it is on the Quran. And so she had to be very public and straightforward and clear when she was making these corrections. But that doesn't mean that she didn't like those companions, even if sometimes she would get a little bit annoyed. So we know that Aisha corrected Abu Huraira in a number of his narrations. Yet, when Aisha was dying, she asked Abu Huraira to lead her funeral prayer. And so we see that, that wouldn't happen without this deep respect that they had for each other. So be very cautious when looking at historical books or other narrations about their relationships and their feelings about each other. We have to be very cautious. Now, I'd like to move on to the question of the personal virtues of Aisha and Umar. Someone had asked a question in an earlier, one of our earlier sessions, was Umar a Sufi, or what was his relationship to Sufism? Now, as with any other discipline or practice, formal area of study and practice in Islam, these things develop. For example, the discipline of fiqh, of understanding the law, develops over time. Hadith studies develops over time. Tafsir develops over time. All of these things develop over time, eventually having their own technical terminology and their kind of sphere of interest and expertise. But at the beginning, we don't have separate disciplines for all of these different areas of knowledge and practice in Islam. So what we see is that just as there develop different schools of law, we have the various madhahib, just as there develop various schools of theology, there also develop various schools of spiritual practice and discipline, tazkiyah and tasawwuf. And so we see many of the keys of that in the practice of Umar and also of Aisha and the other companions, but in some different ways. So, for example, first of all, the most important part is deep love for Allah and His Messenger. And we see that deep love that Aisha and Umar have. I mean, just such wanting to be close, wanting to be near, even when the Blessed Prophet died, wanting to be near him, which is why Aisha continued to live in the place where the Prophet was buried, and why Umar wanted to be buried beside the Prophet. So there's a deep love of wanting to be close to him and wanting to continue to embody his practice and to transmit his beautiful example and teachings to everyone, which they did. So that's the first thing. The second is their abstemious, where they were zohad. Zohad meaning ascetic, that they did not indulge in even those things that were permitted to them. So not luxuries, but even things that were permitted to them, but for a purpose. It was not for the purpose of punishing their bodies. There's no sense that they hated their bodies are bad, they needed to punish them. There isn't this kind of separation that we find in some philosophical traditions later in Islam. That's not at the foundation of what it means to be a Zahid in the beginning of Islam. Both Aisha and Umar were very appreciative of physical strength, of sensuality, of wholesome enjoyment, but it should be simple. And to not indulge in things that were lawful for the sake of being able to focus on something better was certainly part of their practice and of their tradition. And so we see that, for example, let me just open up something here. If I can find it. Let's see. Okay, so here's one of the anecdotes that we could look at. He said, Sayyidina Umar was asked by some of the companions, why don't you have something a little better to eat? Because what they noticed is that what he ate was so simple, and that his clothes also, he kept wearing them as long as they were functional. And even if they had patches, I mean, Ahmed had so many patches on his clothes that he sometimes had more patches than actually the original garment. And people asked him why that was. And he said, my two companions, and by that he meant the Prophet and Abu Bakr, they took a certain path. And if I depart from that path, I might not end up in the same place as them. And so he was very keen, and he wanted to make sure that if he got any little bit of extra enjoyment of this life that might take away from his enjoyment in the next life, he didn't want to have it. And mostly because he really wanted to be with the Blessed Prophet and Abu Bakr. So this is part of his practice. But here's an example to show what the difference was. Okay, so this is a beautiful story. So one of the messengers who came from Syria to visit Umar, he had a message from the governor, and he came to Umar's house, and Umar invited him back into his house, and he said, here, why don't you eat with me? And he had a little bread, oil, and salt. And the messenger says, so I ate a little bit of the food that Umar had given him, but the food I had with me was better than his. So he had some food that he took traveling, in his bag. And it was the food that he had, the travel food, was better than what Umar was offering him, better in terms of like fine quality, right? And then he says, when Umar ate, I have never seen a heartier eater than he. No food stuck to his hand or his mouth. And then when he asked for a drink, they brought him a bowl of barley meal drink. And he said, oh, give the man who's telling the story, give him a drink too. And the man says, I drank a little bit. And he said, whatever I had was better than that. But Umar took the bowl of the barley meal drink and he drank it right up until the bowl knocked against his forehead. And he said, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, who has filled us up with food and quenched our thirst. And so what's beautiful here is that Umar is enjoying this food. It is very simple, basic food. It's not so flavorful. It does not have, some kind of refinement. Yet Umar is eating it and enjoying it. So he wanted food and clothes that would make him strong, that would nourish his body, that would keep his body warm from the cold and cool from the heat, shelter him from the sun. And that was it. And so it is not, it's so important to realize that this is not a punishing kind of attitude to food. In fact, one time when Umar saw a man who appeared to be a zahid, who was mortifying himself, mutamawat. So he was like trying to mortify. Mort means to die, right? Maut, to die. So he was trying to kill his body, right? Punish his body. And this was the kind of body hating or body denying asceticism that we found in the pre-Islamic period among Christianity, especially in Syria. So Syria was famous for these holy men and women who would go for years punishing their body, exposing their body to the sun until it got burnt and boiled, or doing all of these things. And that was a form of spirituality, but Umar and Islam rejected that. Muslim isn't to hate their body, but to discipline their body for the sake of the soul. And so that's what he did. May Allah be pleased with him. Tawakkul was a big factor. Let me just say something more about the body and hating the body. We also see this when it comes to women. So the idea that women's bodies are a source of fitna for men, that their bodies are impure, and these are all things that the Blessed Prophet ﷺ was keen to demonstrate was not the case in Islam. And he did that so often through his relationship with Aisha. So when the Prophet was in the mosque and he wanted a towel or something to be handed him, and he asked Aisha to do that, and she said, well, I'm menstruating. And he said, the menstruation is not in your hand, meaning that the believer's body and the woman's body, when she's menstruating, is not impure ontologically, not in a sense that she herself is not impure. It's that simply that she is in a state of ritual impurity, meaning that she has to purify herself for the sake of ibadah. But it's not that she becomes something else. As the Blessed Prophet said, the believer is never impure. So meaning in themselves, the believer isn't impure. It's just that they are in a state of ritual impurity, meaning they have to make ritual purity in order to undergo the rituals that would follow, like prayer and fasting, for example. And similarly, Aisha, she, just as Umar showed in the way that he ate and the way that he dressed, the proper relationship with the body, Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, showed the same thing. So, for example, when she heard that one of the companions said that if a donkey or a black dog or a woman passes in front of a man when he's praying, that their prayer is invalidated. And Aisha was very angry about this. And she said, does this companion equate women to dogs and donkeys? And she said, and this is how she demonstrated the sunnah with her body, with herself. And this is why her relationship with the Blessed Prophet, her intimate relationship, her long relationship, her loving relationship is so important, because she said, the Blessed Prophet used to pray in the night, and I would be lying in front of him so that my legs, right, my legs were stretched out in front of his qibla. And when he would make sujood, I would draw my legs back. And then when he would stand up, I would put them out again. So she's saying that her legs were in the Blessed Prophet's qibla, demonstrating with her body that a woman's body is not to be hated, or is not a source of ruining a man's prayer. And that's really important. So they both have this embodied sunnah that is the foundation for much of what we understand about the relationship between, or the attitude we should have about our embodied souls and what that means. Both of them were extremely scrupulous. And what do I mean by scrupulous? I mean that they were very careful that whatever they got in terms of money or goods, that they had a right to it. And they were very clear that they, everyone loved them, right? I mean, Ummahatul Mu'mineen, people wanted to earn their favor. There were so many who loved them, who wanted to give them gifts. Sayyidina Umar, he's the Amir al-Mu'mineen. People want to come to him in order to, have some kind of, maybe give him a gift or something so he can give him a favorable opinion. And they were so careful to make sure that that would not happen. So I'll just pull one up here. Okay. So for example, when the Blessed Prophet died, the other wives, the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, they asked Uthman, who was nearby, if he would go to Abu Bakr to get their inheritance from the Prophet. But Aisha stood up and she said, didn't the Messenger of Allah say that no one would inherit from him and that anything he left behind was simply charity? And so she was the one who made sure that they understood that. And she had, clearly they didn't have the same information that she had. And that's why she said that. There are so many stories of Sayyidina Umar, his people coming to him, or if they were afraid of coming to him, they would come to his daughter Hafsa because they knew he loved Hafsa very much. He was very close to her. As I said, he put her in charge of so many of his affairs. And so they would come to her and say, can't you ask him to do this or that, this kind of thing? And when she would come, he would say to her, and he would remind her of their life with the Blessed Prophet and how difficult it was and what they vowed, to do in terms of his legacy. And he would keep reminding her until she would be reduced to tears. And of course, she only wanted what was good for her father and for the believers. But it was so important that he remind her that even though he loved his family, he did love his family, that they would have to, he wanted what was best for them. And what was best was to continue on this same path as the others. Now, disciplining their ego. This is something that we think about as a spiritual practice, as part of tasawwuf as it would develop, a part of tazkiyah. And this is something that we see regularly. So Anas ibn Malik, for example, one time heard Umar pacing around in an orchard, and he was saying to himself, he was walking around saying, Umar ibn al-Khattab is Amir al-Mu'mineen. Well done, well done. But Wallahi ibn al-Khattab, Wallahi, ittaqillah, or Allah will punish you. Fear Allah, or Allah will punish you. So he's talking to himself, to his nafs, and saying to his nafs, oh, okay, yes, it's good that you became Amir al-Mu'mineen, but you better be careful. Fear Allah, or Allah will punish you. So it's this beautiful example. Aisha, in her life, she would regularly seek forgiveness, and she would repeat some of the words of Sayyidina Maryam in the Quran, the mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who would say, I wish that I had died before this or been a thing forgotten. So when she was giving birth to Jesus, and in that pain, and not only the pain, the physical pain, but knowing what would come, what Allah was opening in terms of this beautiful blessing, but also this challenge. And Aisha would say that as well, just thinking about the great responsibility that Allah had put on her, And we see in Sufi literature later that many of the great Sufis would repeat something like this, that it's not that they were depressed or something like that. It's that they realized that existence itself was such an incredible gift and also responsibility for the human being, and they hoped to be able to live up to what was possible and what they could do. And they knew that they could never fully realize all of their capacities. And having that, falling short of that, for someone who wants to do the best can be very difficult. So here I want to show you something that is, I'm going to put this over here. I'm going to just share my screen with you for a minute. And this is in terms of so we've talked about their personal virtues, and we could go on and have, so much more about this. But if we move from their personal virtues to who they transmitted or passed on their knowledge and their best example, their role modeling to. And of course, I'm in a different setting today than I was in the other 3 lectures. Today I'm in my office, in my library. And as you can see, like any library, there are a lot of books. And how many of these books are filled with their names? Their legacy is to us in terms of their embodied practice, their transmission of hadith, their transmission of the sunnah, their application of the sunnah, their understanding of the Quran, their setting practices and principles for us to follow. But here I just want to show just something here that will show you something of their legacy that is very critical. So if we look at this first section, I'm focusing on Umar and his legacy. And in this section, I'm focusing on Aisha and her legacy. And here we have relatives, those who were related to Umar, who became so critical for all of us. They were the ones who passed on so much of Islam to us. Of course, his daughter Hafsa bint Umar. Hafsa, who was the guardian of the Mus'haf and the protector of the Mus'haf, that was the the original Mus'haf for preserving the Quran in a written form. In addition, obviously there was the oral form as well, but this was in the written form. Hafsa also, as we know, was the executor of her and director of her father's waqf, and that charitable endowment was very critical for setting the foundation for for Islamic institutions until today, the concept of waqf. Then there is Abdullah bin Umar, his son. Abdullah, as I said before, his father refused to allow him to get anywhere near politics. And this allowed Ibn Umar to focus on learning. Ibn Umar is one of the most important transmitters of hadith. He is one of the most important interpreters of the sunnah. And he played that role in such an essential way. In hadith scholars call the golden chain, the golden isnad or golden chain of transmission, the chain from Imam Malik to Nafi to Abdullah ibn Umar. So this is considered to be the most reliable and strong isnad for the transmission of hadith. And that is Umar's son. And Umar's son, too, what's the next link? This is Nafi, who's the Mawla of Abdullah ibn Umar. Mawla means the freed man. the freed men. So Nafi had been a captive, and Abdullah ibn Umar, under Ibn Umar's control. Ibn Umar freed him, taught him, supported him, so that he became this tremendously important transmitter of hadith and of the sunnah, and is right there in the middle of that golden chain. Then there is Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar. So Umar's grandson, the son of Abdullah ibn Umar, who is one of the 7 jurists of Medina. So the 7 jurists of Medina, who are considered the ones who really articulated and set out what the practice and the understanding of the Sunnah was for Medina, and the school of Medina that became the school of Malik, so the Maliki school. And then, of course, there's Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who was one of the Umayyad caliphs. He was the great grandson of Umar through his mother's line. So his mother, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz's mother, was the granddaughter of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the governor of Medina for a long time until he became caliph. And he was only caliph for 2 years. But he is the one he's often called the second Umar, and he is the one who tried as much as possible to put the caliphate, put the leadership of the Muslim Ummah back on track. And so he was extremely ascetic. He was a zahid. He tried to imitate his grandfather as much as possible. He tried to clean up the corruption in the caliphate. He made orders to treat all of the Muslims as equal, not to discriminate against the non-Arabs. So he was such a beautiful, beautiful example, but he only lived 2 years, or he only lived 2 years as caliph. And so after that, the Umayyad Caliphate went back and, had good and increasingly bad leadership. And it's interesting, when there was the Abbasid Revolution and people came through Damascus, and of course there were some in that army who were completely violating the boundaries that Allah had set, and many of them, they went, a group of them went and desecrated the graves of the Umayyad caliphs, but no one touched the grave of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz because he was respected by everyone. And so here is this legacy that Umar has just in his own family, and it shows you how impactful. And these aren't all of them. I mean, I wanted to focus on a few of the most famous ones, but it shows how another way that he was so foundational to Islam, and that his example is one that is just goes on and on and on. Now, what if we look at Aisha? Here we have, I've just given 4 people. These are not even, again, these are a limited number of people. So we have Aisha's nephew, Urwa ibn al-Zubair. He is the son of her sister Asma and of Abdullah of al-Zubair ibn Awam. He is one of the 7 jurists of Medina as well. So he's a transmitter of hadith, he's a jurist, he's a scholar who sets the foundation for the Medinan school. Aisha's niece, Aisha bint Talha. So Aisha bint Talha is the daughter of Talha, and her mother, Aisha bint Talha's mother, is Kulthum bint Abi Bakr. And Aisha was charged by Abu Bakr with raising and bringing up and taking care of Kulthum. Aisha bint Talha is a very important transmitter of hadith in the successor generation. She also had her aunt's great strength of character, her outspokenness, and Aisha bint Talha was someone who constantly pushed back against those who wanted to keep her in a box, as it were. She was very outspoken. She was very public. She lived her life very publicly. And because of that, also as a public person, she was a great link in the chain of transmitting hadith. Aisha's other niece, Amra bint Abdurrahman, so the daughter of her full brother, Abdurrahman, Amra is a very important transmitter of the sunnah as well. And you'll see that link from Amra to Aisha very, very often in the Muwatta again. So these are for all of these figures, all of these companion successors and beyond are important for all Muslims, but we can see it intensely if we look at the school of Medina through the Muwatta of Imam Malik. You're going to see these names again and again and again and again. Now, another nephew of Aisha, this is the son of her brother Muhammad al-Qasim ibn Muhammad. He is also one of the 7 jurists of Medina, whose name you're going to see again, transmitter of hadith, of the sunnah, jurist, interpreter of the tradition. So all of these, her nephews and her nieces, she took care of them, she taught them, she formed them in their character, she gave them advice, she arranged marriages, she helped them when they had family problems. And so here, if we think about the role that she played as mother of the believers, al-Mu'mineen, for all Muslims, and we have many narrations of companions coming to her and asking her, some men who will ask her something, and they'll say, I have a question, but it's really embarrassing. And Aisha would say, oh, don't be embarrassed. Just tell me anything like you would ask your mother. Frankly, some of the things they asked her, I don't know if many sons would ask their mothers, but these were very frank conversations. And so she was the mother of the believers to everyone, but she also was that aunt who plays the role, and we see it in many families. If there's an aunt who does not have her own children, or who has never been married, or who is widowed or single, very often that woman has a kind of freedom because she's free of responsibilities to her husband or free of responsibilities to her own children, that she can be the one who really focuses on the education of her nephews and nieces. I had an aunt like that. So I had an aunt who was never married, and she played that role for me and many in my family as well, of being that one who enriched our life with education and art and culture. She had a PhD. She really encouraged me as I was doing my PhD. And so this is a critical role that Aisha is playing with this core group of her family who are so important to Islam. And so this is why we should never think of any state that we have in our life as bad. There's no state that is bad. Everything that Allah has destined for us has potential benefit if we see it. So Aisha never had children of her own, and while she was widowed as a very young woman and lived a long time, many decades as a widow without a husband, that she used that time to benefit her immediate family and the Muslim Ummah all as well in doing so. So she's really just an amazing example to us for that. Now we're nearing the end of the time for today, so I'd just like to pull up a few other points in terms of the judgments that they made. So one of the things we see about Umar ibn al-Khattab is he's not a big transmitter of hadith, but he is a transmitter of the sunnah. And people considered his actions to be sunnah, right? What he did was sunnah. And this was because he had internalized and embodied the principles and values of the Blessed Prophet, which of course, who was himself, as Aisha said, a walking Quran. So these are the Quranic principles. So he's living and embodying these Islamic principles. And again, we see him making judgments and developing new administrative procedures or regulations in that spirit. They are things that we might call what would come to be called things like siyasa sharia, which is an administration or law or regulation according to the principles of the Sharia. And I mentioned a number of them in our lecture last week. For example, he enforced the ban on temporary marriage. He enforced the rights of the Walad. In many cases, when it came to women, he deferred to women experts. So when there were cases that were brought before him that had to do with women, he would go and consult with women experts and say, give me your judgment about this because you're an expert in this area, if it was like a physiological issue, something like that. And so this is one thing that's really important with Sayyidina Umar, is that he does, he's not a know-it-all. He's not saying that I have all the power, I'm just going to decide everything. Always is in wide consultation, but sometimes his opinions are perceived by the men to be limiting their rights. When they want to, have freedom to do whatever they want with women, it is actually Umar who is so often mischaracterized as a misogynist or against women's rights, but it is Umar who reins in those men to protect and support women and assert their rights. We know the stories, for example, when Umar tried to limit the amount of the mahar that a woman would get. And one of the women stood up and said, Umar, you cannot put a limit on this. This is our right from God. And Umar said, the woman is right and Umar is wrong. And that's an important affirmation in saying that he is affirming that she is a woman. She knows her position, she knows her rights, and we should listen to her for her expertise in her rights and to hear her voice. So he did not try to silence women, but he consulted with them and listened to them. Both Aisha and Umar were very careful about thinking about how their example might affect others, because even if they would tell others that, I'm only doing this for my own personal benefit or voluntarily, they realize that anyone in a position of power has influence. And this is what we should think about, is that if you choose to accept a position of influence, then you have to accept that you have more responsibility for monitoring that influence. And we know that Aisha chose to accept this position of influence, as we said in lecture 2, I believe it was, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the Prophet to offer a choice to his wives, that they could either stay married to him, and in doing so, they would get double the punishment for anything they did wrong, but double the reward if they did right, or they could be released from the marriage bond in a free manner and they would be supported. And Aisha and the other Ummahatul Mu'mineen, they chose Allah and his messenger. And so in making that choice, she knows that what she does will have an influence on others. Sayyidina Umar also knew that whatever he did would have an influence on others. And that's why they were so cautious with what they ate, with never taking any money that did not belong to them, with their clothes. They both, both of them were known for fasting all the time, regularly, not all the time, not every day, but, almost continuously. And when they were asked things, they were very thoughtful about how it might affect others. So, for example, Aisha was once asked, does a woman need a mahram to travel? And Aisha responded, can every woman find a mahram? Right? So she's thinking about, well, what about people who are not in the same position of privilege as me? And her style in doing that, asking this rhetorical question, rather than saying yes or no, right? You could say yes or no. If she just said no, that's it. But actually by saying, can every woman find a mahram? It should make us, it gives us a practice of thinking, when I want to design some program, or, build a mosque or do something, right? I should always think not only of what I would like and what would be beneficial to me, but what about others who might be in a different situation? So this is this practice of, now we call it inclusion and diversity, but we see it. Similarly, because we're near the end of the time, I can't tell too many stories, but one time Sayyidina Umar was traveling, and he woke up and he found that he needed to wash his clothes before moving on. And this was actually he was with a troop of Muslims that were on a important journey from one place to somewhere else. So there wasn't any water there. So he rode off, found a well, and took off his shirt and he starts washing his clothes. And one of the companions came to him and he's like waiting. And then he finally says, okay, it's morning now. We've got other clothes you can wear. So just stop doing this. You can clean them later and we'll give you clothes. And Umar turned to him. He said, how strange that you say this. You might be someone who has new clothes, but does everyone have new clothes that they could just leave the clothes they're wearing aside and pick up other clothes? We often forget that the early Muslims lived in a really subsistence level society in material terms. There were people who had one set of clothes. If they wanted to clean their clothes, they had to go find a private place, take off their clothes, wash them, let them dry, then put them back on. They didn't have a clean set to change when one was dirty. And so here again, and so Ahmed, he said, if I were to do that, if I were just to, take this off and put this other one on, that could become a sunnah. And he was very aware that his practice would be considered sunnah. And so that's why he's showing, even to the annoyance of these other men, that he's going to take his time and wash his clothes by himself, to show that, that can be done. Many times, both Umar and Aisha invoked words like justice and fairness, words like ma'ruf. The Quran says that again and again in so many cases, that we are the community who ya'muruna bil ma'rufi wa yanhauna 'anil munkar. We promote and we promote what is good. We work for what is good and fair and just, and we stop what is harmful. We try to dismantle what is harmful. We try to block what is harmful. And we see them invoking these concepts very regularly in their practice and their decision making. And this becomes a concept then that we should always keep in mind, because what we should do is not just the absolute limit of, obligatory or haram, right? There's so much in there that is contextual, and it is these nuances of how do we contextualize and apply the principles that we have that are so important. And it is through their example that we can learn so much. I would love to go on and on, but there are other programs to enjoy. For those in the UK, you need to be going and preparing your iftar pretty soon. Here in where I am in London, Ontario, Canada, it's only 2 p.m. So we've got quite a ways to go on this. We finally have the sun come out after many rainy days. Alhamdulillah, we needed that blessing. So I'm going to do a few things before we get to the end. One, some of you had asked for some sources, and what I will do, because I realize that I did not put it together in a document that I could easily share, what I will do is I will write a few sources and I'll put them out on my Twitter, and CMC can pick that up and maybe add it or put it somewhere else. Or maybe once this video is up on YouTube, I might be able to add it to the notes in the YouTube. So I will do that. I know that you have some questions as well for me today as well. And so I can add those. I can look at those as well. Let me see if there's some I can answer right here. Are there any ulama that have looked deeper into the issue of unreliable historical narratives surrounding the Sahaba after the demise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Yes. So there is historiography, and there are studies looking at various incidents. But again, we're all dealing with the same sources, right? So we don't have new sources that come up. Most of them are secondary. They're reports of other people. We don't have original documentation. And that's why I think it is important to look at things like marriages, for example, because that is also evidence that can counter maybe some of the reports. So there are things that we can, there's also negative evidence. If someone says, well, these people hate each other or this or that happened, why did, why was there no objection raised publicly, something like that. And that's where you'll find the reply is often, well, they said something, but it was secret, or they didn't want to. And that kind of, as soon as you get into that there, that, that kind of resort to hidden intentions or secret conversations is how are any of us supposed to scrutinize those, right? Anyone could say anything at that point. And none of the companions who knew that they were responsible for helping to continue the sunnah and to shape the Muslim community would have been silent about something that was so important. Would it be, and then I have a question, I'm looking at the questions that were sent in. There's another question that says, would it be correct that hadith are not gender specific? For example, unless specified, men and women should be equal in following the sunnah, right? Yes. And again, here, hadith are just reports about the sunnah, right? So hadiths are little bits of information that tell us something, or that report to tell us something about the sunnah. What we're really after is the sunnah itself, right? And the sunnah can be transmitted through reports. It can be transmitted through behavior. It can be transmitted through practice as well. And yes, all of this, the sunnah is for all of us. It is for all of us, unless there is a specification that this is something in particular for men or for women. We are all charged to obey Allah and His Messenger, and to follow that path, and to know that that path is the best one. And that's something that's so remarkable about the Blessed Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when I look to his example, because the Prophet had this perfect balance of qualities and characteristics, it is not, his example is not something that I, as a woman, feel I can't follow or attain, or is some kind of some version of masculinity that excludes all of humanity. So it is a sunnah that is for human beings, for all of us. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But because there are some things that are for men and some for women, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to surround the Blessed Prophet with a community of men and women in all of their diverse personalities and characters and capacities, so that each one of us, can look to them, and through their example, find something that applies to our situation or resonates with us. As we are now at the end of this 4-part series. I want to thank you so much for joining me in this. I apologize if sometimes things are not a little bit so organized. It's very challenging being alone without any technical support. And, in this pandemic, we're still very locked down in Canada. We can't have anyone in our home or can't go into the office. So very grateful for CMC for their support. So things have not been always well organized. Or there have been technical problems. I apologize for that, or for anything I might have said that is mistaken along the way. This is a live lecture, so it's also just challenging sometimes with the material and responding to things as we manage these technicalities. I am so grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have had this chance to review the beautiful examples of al-Mu'mineen Aisha and al-Mu'mineen Umar. They are two of the great companions who I return to again and again. We see their esteem that they had for each other. We see that that they supported each other. We see that they both set this foundation in their personal behavior, in how they shaped their families and those who were close to them, in their practice, in their service. They planted and cultivated and nurtured so that we could harvest so much incredible, life-giving, and beneficial knowledge. May Allah be pleased with them, and may Allah allow us to join them one day in the shade of Allah's mercy. Finally, before I leave today, I want to say that Cambridge Muslim College continues to take your submissions for seed stories. So they're taking submissions from all of you about seeds that you've grown in the past, present, or plan to plant in the future. Perhaps a good habit you've cultivated, a class you've started, some project you're starting to do. Please send those in, and they will put a link for instructions on where to send in your seed stories. Second, please do send CMC feedback about what you thought about the Ramadan live sessions for 2021 and for their programming in general. I know I've benefited from so much of it, and I hope you have as well. But they won't know that unless you send that information. And so please send them feedback, and that they will put up a feedback form for you as well. And finally, of course, please support this this institution, Cambridge Muslim College, that over the years has grown. As I've said, I really have so much admiration and love for CMC. It's why why I come back to teaching on this platform. And someday, inshallah, I'll go back to Cambridge for a visit and see everyone, and renew my relationship with that in-person community as well, that beautiful place. But of course, none of this can be done without your support. They have hired more people, they have more programming, they have more buildings to house and support students, and all of it is done in the most beautiful way. But nothing that is without thought. Everything is very thoughtful, simple, and beautiful. And please contribute to it. Inshallah, God willing, whatever you give will continue to nurture students and the transmission of knowledge and practice for generations to come. It will be a sadaqah jariyah. So please support Cambridge Muslim College. And with that, I will be signing out. I wish you and your families, all of you, that you have the opportunity to continue to enjoy all of the blessings of Ramadan and the blessings of these last 10 days of Ramadan. May Allah keep you and your families safe, guide you, protect you, have mercy on you. May Allah forgive and have mercy on those of our brothers and sisters who have passed away. May Allah heal the sick. May Allah strengthen and give courage to all of those who are struggling. May Allah increase the compassion in our heart towards each others. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum.